Hello everyone. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It helps these stories find the people who need them most. Now, let the night take over. The night the Library of Alexandria was lost. Part 1. The night Alexandria still breathed. And the city was quieter than it pretended to be. Even at night, Alexandria never truly stopped. It only changed its voice. In the daylight, it shouted hawkers and arguments, carts rattling over stone, gulls cutting the air above the harbour. But after sunset, when the heat loosened its grip and the long shadows settled into the streets, the city became a low, steady murmur, like a great animal breathing in its sleep. I walked slowly, not because I was tired, but because the night asked for it. The stones beneath my sandals were warm from the day. They held the sun the way parchment holds ink stubbornly, as if refusing to forget. A lantern swung from a hook near a doorway, painting a small circle of amber light across a wall of pale plaster. The flame inside the glass shivered whenever the sea wind found a narrow alley to rush through. Alexandria was built on wind. It came in from the Mediterranean and carried the scent of salt and tar, fish and wet rope, and something else that was harder to name. Spices, perhaps, or old wood, or the faint metallic tang that rises from ships after long voyages. If you listened closely, you could hear the harbour even from streets that could not see it. The creak of mooring lines, the soft knock of hulls, the occasional distant call of a sailor who spoke a language you didn't know. And in Alexandria, that meant very little. Not knowing a language was temporary. In one short stretch of road, I passed a group of men speaking Greek quick, confident syllables that carried like pebbles thrown across water. A moment later, I heard Egyptian words, older and softer, shaped by the throat and the tongue, as if the sound itself had been carved from the river. Somewhere behind a shuttered shop, a woman scolded a child in a kind of Latin that still sounded foreign, as though the empire had never fully settled in the mouth. This city was a knot of worlds, tied so tightly that no one could pull the strands apart again. I turned toward the north where the air grew cooler. Ahead, beyond the rooftops, the lighthouse rose over the dark line of the seafarers, a name spoken the way people speak of mountains or storms. Even at night it was present, not always visible, but always felt. Its fire was a promise to travelers. You can find this place. You can come here. You can land. So they did. Ships arrived from Cyprus, from Rhodes, from Crete, from Antioch and Tyre, from ports along Africa's edge where the sand was red and the sun seemed closer, from the western sea where Rome ruled by law and iron, and from the eastern routes where caravans carried silk and glass, and stories that grew wilder the farther they traveled. Some came for grain, because Egypt fed the world. Some came for gold, because gold has always convinced men that they are wise. But others came for something stranger, something that could not be weighed in a merchant's palm. They came for words, not the words of poets in taverns, nor the bargains whispered in markets. They came for the kind of words that outlived the hands that wrote them. Words pressed into papyrus and sealed with wax. Words that traveled in bundles, tied with string. Words that, if gathered in one place, could change what a person believed was possible. A cat slipped across the road ahead of me, a shadow with bright eyes. It paused, looked back as if measuring my intentions, and then disappeared between two columns into a courtyard where someone had left a bowl of water. I passed a small shrine with an oil lamp burning in front of it. The flame was steady. A man had placed fresh flowers there earlier, white petals, already beginning to curl at the edges. The gods were still being honored, even now, even in places where it had become risky to do so. Alexandria was full of careful people who practiced their courage quietly. As I continued, the buildings changed. The streets near the harbour were made for trade-low storefronts, warehouses with heavy doors, courtyards stacked with amphorae like rows of sleeping giants. But as you moved inland, the city grew more formal. Columns appeared, then porticos. The walls were smoother here. The stones fitted so tightly that a knife could not slide between them. The city's wealth became visible in how carefully it had been constructed. And then, without announcement, you reached the district where Alexandria stored what it valued most. Not its grain, not its ships, its mind. The first time I came here, years ago, I expected a building that looked like power. Something that would strike fear or awe into the bones. Fortified walls, perhaps. Guards with spears. Great doors with bronze hinges. But the place I walked toward did not threaten. It welcomed. It was not one building, not even one set of rooms. People who had never seen it spoke of it as if it were a single chamber filled with endless shelves. But that was the way outsiders imagined knowledge. Neat, stacked, tidy. The library, the great collection, was part of something larger. A living complex of halls and gardens and colonnades attached to the Mausion, a place devoted to the muses, where scholars lived and worked like monks of a different religion. There were dining rooms where arguments lasted for hours, courtyards where voices rose and fell like birdsong, rooms where scrolls rested in niches behind wooden panels, protected from damp and careless hands. It was not a temple, and yet people treated it like one. As I approached, I saw two figures sitting near a wall where the lamplight reached. They were young, perhaps apprentices, their heads bent close together over something flat and pale, a piece of papyrus held down by small stones at the corners. One of them traced lines with a finger while the other listened. They weren't laughing. They weren't flirting. They were doing something rarer at that hour. They were paying attention. I nodded to them as I passed. One of them looked up and returned the gesture with a seriousness that made me feel older than I was. At the edge of the complex, an old man sat on a low bench, his hands folded over the top of a walking stick. His eyes were open, but his gaze was unfixed, as if he were reading something invisible in the air. When I moved closer, he spoke without turning his head. "Late," he said. "Early," I replied, "depending on the work." A thin smile appeared and vanished. "Depending on the world," he corrected softly. In Alexandria, that was always the question. What world were you in? The one that had been, with its gods and philosophies and careful logic? The one that was arriving, with its new faith and sharpened certainty? Or the one that lived only inside the library's walls, where a person could hold two ideas at once without fearing the consequences? I stepped beneath an archway and felt the air change. Outside, the night carried salt and smoke and conversation. Inside, it carried dust dry and clean, and the faint scent of cedar oil rubbed into wood to keep insects away. I could hear my own breathing more clearly. I could hear the small sounds of the place, the distant scratch of a reed pen, the soft whisper of sandals on stone, the occasional cough someone tried to hide. There was no singing, no prayers, no formal rituals, but there was reverence. A lamp burned in a niche near the entrance. Its light made the plaster look almost gold. I paused there, as I always did, and let my eyes adjust. It was a habit, like washing hands before a meal. Not because it changed anything, but because it reminded me that I was entering a place where the ordinary rules did not apply. Beyond the first corridor lay a courtyard with a fig tree at its center. The tree's leaves were dark and thick, and a few figs had fallen to the ground, splitting open. The sweetness of the fruit rose faintly in the warm air. Somewhere above, a small bird shifted in its sleep. This, I thought, is what people never understand. They imagine that knowledge is cold, that it belongs to marble and silence, to men in stiff robes speaking in difficult words. But the library was alive. It had trees, it had dust, it had fruit. It had arguments and ink stains and careless laughter in the dining hall when someone made a joke so clever that even the strictest grammarian couldn't pretend not to smile. And because it was alive, it could die. That thought came to me without invitation, and I let it pass the way one lets a cloud pass across the moon. I had learned, over the years, not to grab at every dark idea that drifted through the mind. Most of them were only visitors. I walked deeper in. In a side chamber, a set of wooden racks stood against the wall, each holding cylindrical containers, scroll cases labeled in careful script. The labels were practical, not poetic. Mathematics, medicine, tragedies, geography. The words looked simple, almost harmless, but I knew what they contained. Inside those cases were measurements of the world, recorded when the world was younger. Diagrams of machines that moved without animals. Lists of stars and their patterns. Notes on eclipses that could make a crowd believe the gods were angry. Remedies that healed and remedies that killed. Histories written by men who had watched kingdoms fall and still found time to describe the shape of a coastline. A person could ruin themselves in here without anyone lifting a hand. That was why it mattered. Not because it was powerful, but because it was honest. It held the record of what people had tried, what they had failed to do, what they had done by accident. It held the long, patient proof that human beings were capable of more than fear and hunger. I reached the corridor that led toward the writing rooms. A faint light spilled from beneath one door. Someone was already awake, or still awake. As I approached, I heard the sound that always calmed me. The slow, steady scratch of a pen. Not hurried, not frantic. Just the quiet insistence of a mind copying another mind across time. I placed my hand on the doorframe, not yet entering, and listened for a moment longer. Outside these walls, Alexandria shifted and argued and changed. Empires made promises and broke them. Faiths rose and hardened. People found new reasons to hate each other, as if the old reasons had grown dull. But here, in this corridor, in this lamplight, the world still believed in something simple. That if you saved a sentence, you saved a piece of a person. And if you saved enough sentences, you saved a civilization. I stepped inside, and the night, which had been only a night, began to become a story. A place built to hold everything. And the writing room smelled of oil and ink. It was a clean smell, sharp but not unpleasant. the scent of lamps that had burned through many careful nights, and of reed pens trimmed so often that their tips grew soft with use. The walls held the warmth of the day, and the stone floor was cool beneath my feet, balancing the heat like a slow breath in and out. At 3 tables along the far wall, men worked in silence. Each table held a small lamp, its flame shielded by thin bronze so the light fell downward, never directly into the eyes. Scrolls lay unrolled in measured sections, weighted at the corners with smooth stones polished by years of hands. Nothing here was accidental. The room had been shaped by experience, by what allowed the mind to stay awake without strain, to move steadily without haste. I closed the door behind me with care. One of the scribes glanced up, recognized me, and returned to his work without a word. We did not greet each other aloud. Speech belonged to daylight. At night, the library preferred gestures. I moved to the empty table near the window. Outside, the city's sounds reached us as a distant blur. No longer words or footsteps, but a soft, uneven pulse. Here, inside, time moved differently, measured not by bells or calls, but by how much of a text had been copied before the oil in a lamp ran low. I loosened the string on a scroll case and slid the papyrus free. The label was plain, on the measurement of the earth. It was a copy of a copy of a copy, written generations ago by a man who had watched the shadow of the sun fall differently in 2 cities and realized the world must be curved. His method was elegant, almost playful. A few angles, a few distances, and suddenly the size of the earth something no one could walk around became a number. That was how knowledge lived here, not as miracles, but as patient steps. Across the room, an older scholar paused, lifted his pen, and frowned. He leaned closer to the text before him, tracing a line with his finger. I knew that look. It meant the copy in front of him disagreed with the copy he remembered. Soon there would be a discussion. Not now. Not yet. First, he would check another version. This was the library's true work, and it rarely appeared in the stories people told. They spoke of shelves and numbers, hundreds of thousands of scrolls, they said, as if quantity alone explained anything. But the heart of the place was not accumulation. It was comparison. Every ship that entered Alexandria's harbor was subject to inspection. Not for contraband, not for weapons, but for writing. If a captain carried books or scrolls, they were taken, not stolen, but borrowed. The originals were kept. Copies were made with care, letter by letter, line by line. Then the copies were returned to the ship, while the originals stayed behind, added to the growing body of the library. Some complained, most understood. A few never noticed the difference. I had heard sailors boast that they carried Homer, or Aristotle, or the laws of some distant city. They did not know that the words they carried home were not the same ones they had brought. And yet, the meaning survived. That was enough. At the far end of the room, a young man shifted on his bench and stretched his fingers. He was new, still learning how to sit for hours without turning discomfort into distraction. His scroll lay untouched for a moment longer than necessary. I caught his eye and tilted my head toward the text. He nodded, embarrassed, and returned to his work. No one scolded him. No one needed to. The library did not run on fear. It ran on something more fragile: trust. If you were here, it was because someone believed you could be. Beyond the writing room lay the storage halls, long and narrow, their walls lined with wooden niches. Each niche held scrolls sealed in cases, arranged not by age or prestige, but by subject. Poetry rested beside philosophy, medicine beside astronomy. No hierarchy, no sacred ordering, only the quiet assumption that understanding the body mattered as much as understanding the stars. I walked between the rows, letting my fingers brush the smooth wood. Some of these texts were familiar, others I had never opened. There were works written in tongues no one here spoke anymore, their meanings surviving only because someone long ago had cared enough to translate them. There were treatises by men whose names had already faded, even though their ideas lived on, anonymous and unclaimed. The library did not care about authorship. It cared about survival. A voice reached me from behind a column. "You're late tonight." I turned. It was Demetrios, his hair more grey than black now, his robe stained at the cuff with ink he would never quite wash out. He carried 2 scrolls tucked under one arm, as if they were extensions of his body. "Early," I said, repeating the old answer. He smiled. "Still pretending the world runs on our schedule? Still pretending it runs on reason." He laughed quietly and gestured for me to follow. We moved into a smaller chamber where a single lamp burned low. He set the scrolls on the table and unrolled them side by side. At first glance, the texts looked identical, but Demetrios pointed to a line near the center. "Here," he said, "and here." I leaned in. A single word differed. One copy spoke of a mechanism powered by water. The other described the same device, but driven by air. "Which is correct?" I asked. "That," he said, "is why we are here." We stood in silence, weighing the implications. A change like that was not small. It altered what was possible. It shifted a design from rivers to wind, from one landscape to another. Somewhere in the past, someone had made a mistake, or someone had improved the idea. Without the library, there would be no way to know. Demetrios rolled the scrolls closed again with care. "We'll check the 3rd copy tomorrow." "Assuming tomorrow comes," I said lightly. He studied me for a moment, then looked away. "It always has." But neither of us sounded certain. As the night deepened, the writing rooms filled and emptied in quiet cycles. Lamps were trimmed. Pens were cut again and again until they grew too short to use. Some scholars left, others arrived, trading places like guards on a wall no one admitted needed guarding. In the dining hall, someone had left a bowl of figs and bread. I took one and ate slowly, letting the sweetness ground me. Hunger was the enemy of thought. So was exhaustion. The library understood both. That was why it fed its scholars, why it housed them, why it gave them time. Knowledge it had learned did not survive on brilliance alone. It survived on care. Near the end of the night, I returned to the writing room and finished my copy. I read the final line twice, then once more, not for accuracy, but for sense. The words settled into place, familiar now, as if they had always belonged there. I tied the scroll with a fresh string and set it aside to dry. Around me, others did the same. One by one, lamps were dimmed. The room softened, edges blurring as the light withdrew. Outside, the city began to stir in its sleep, preparing to wake. I paused at the doorway and looked back. So much of the world believed that power came from force, from commands given loudly and obeyed quickly. But here, in these rooms, power took another form. It was slow. It was quiet. It required patience and the willingness to admit uncertainty. That, more than anything else, made it dangerous. I stepped into the corridor, carrying the faint smell of ink with me. Behind me, the library continued its work, unaware that the night was not finished with it yet. When ideas became dangerous. By the time the lamps were extinguished in the writing rooms, the night had changed its character. Alexandria was no longer breathing evenly. Outside the library's walls, the city had begun to stir not toward morning, but toward unease. It was the kind of restlessness that did not announce itself with noise. It moved quietly, through looks held a little too long, through conversations that stopped when someone unfamiliar passed by. I felt it as I crossed the courtyard. The fig tree stood as it always had, its leaves unmoved by whatever currents were shifting beyond the stone. A few crushed fruits darkened the ground beneath it, already drawing ants. Life continued with admirable indifference. At the far colonnade, voices carried in low tones. I slowed, not to listen, but because instinct told me the night was no longer indifferent to who heard what. Two men stood near a pillar, half hidden by shadow. One wore the plain robe of a city official, clean but unadorned. The other I recognized as a former student, sharp-eyed, earnest, and once endlessly curious. Now his hands moved too much when he spoke. "You still keep them all?" the younger man asked. "All?" the official replied. "No one keeps all of anything anymore." "That's not what I meant." The official sighed, the sound of a man already tired of a conversation he had repeated many times. "Then say what you mean." The younger man hesitated, glancing toward the inner halls. "The old texts, the ones that contradict." "Contradict what?" "What we are trying to build." The official's voice lowered further. "Careful." I did not wait to hear more. I had heard enough. This was how it began. Not with flames or soldiers, but with discomfort. With the realization that knowledge, once admired, could become inconvenient. Dangerous not because it inspired rebellion, but because it refused to stay quiet. Inside the library, the shelves did not know they had been weighed and found troubling. The scrolls rested where they always had, sealed and labeled, patient as stone. They had survived kings and wars and plagues. They had outlasted cities, but they had never faced certainty. I moved into a long hall where statues lined the walls. Poets, mathematicians, philosophers carved in pale stone. Their expressions were calm, distant. Men who had argued fiercely in life were frozen now in agreement, united by time if nothing else. A group of scholars sat nearby, speaking in hushed voices. I recognized their tones immediately. This was not debate. Debate was energetic, alive. This was something narrower, concern. "They say the bishop wants a list," one murmured. "A list of what?" "Of texts that should be reviewed," another voice snorted softly. "Reviewed by whom? Men who cannot read Greek?" "Men who can read power." A pause followed. Then, "Do they know how many of those texts disagree with one another? That may be the problem." I leaned against a column, letting the cool stone press into my shoulder. For generations, the library had lived under a fragile agreement. It did not rule. It did not command. It offered no laws, no armies, no miracles. In return, it was allowed to exist, tolerated by rulers who saw it as harmless or useful or too prestigious to dismantle. But the city was changing. Faith was becoming organized. Doctrine was being sharpened. Where once contradiction had been a tool, something that forced thought, it was now treated as a flaw. Truth, people were beginning to say, should be singular, clear, defended. There was no place for footnotes in certainty. I thought of the two scrolls Demetrios had shown me. Water or air. One word altered, one idea shifted. In the library, that was an invitation to investigate. Outside it, such a difference could be labeled an error, or worse, a threat. I walked on. In a smaller chamber near the eastern wing, I found Helena seated alone, her lamp turned low. She was older than most of us, though no one remembered exactly how old. She had arrived in Alexandria from the west decades ago and never left. Some said she slept among the scrolls. Others claimed she remembered texts no one else could find. She looked up as I entered. "You feel it too," she said, not as a question. "The city?" "The air," she replied. "It's tightening." I sat opposite her. "We've lived through tensions before." "Yes," she said, "but this one believes it is right." She gestured toward the shelves. When men believed in many gods, they could tolerate many answers. One god demands one story. "That is an oversimplification," I said gently. She smiled. "Everything important is." Helena reached for a scroll beside her, unrolled it just enough to reveal a diagram circles within circles, lines crossing at precise angles. "This," she said, tapping the papyrus, "describes the motion of the planets." I studied it. "Ptolemy?" "And others," she replied. "Some who disagreed with him." "Of course." She met my eyes. "Outside these walls, disagreement is becoming sin." We sat with that thought. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, not the libraries, but the cities. A call to prayer, sharp and certain, cutting through the softer sounds of the night. It was answered by another bell farther away, then another. Different faiths, different rhythms, overlapping, but not aligning. Alexandria had always been a place of many voices. Now they were learning to compete. "When I was young," Helena said quietly, "people came here to ask questions. Now they come to prove answers." "What will they do with the rest?" I asked. She rolled the scroll closed. "Ignore it if we're lucky. Bury it if we're not. And if we're very unlucky," she did not answer immediately, "they will decide that forgetting is an act of devotion." The words settled heavily between us. I stood and walked back into the main hall. The statues watched in silence. The shelves offered no counsel. Knowledge never defended itself. That had always been its weakness and its dignity. I thought of the apprentices I had seen earlier, bent over their work with untrained seriousness. They copied because they trusted. They believed that what they preserved would be wanted. No one had told them otherwise. As the night moved forward, a subtle change spread through the library. Doors closed that usually remained open. Conversations ended sooner. A few scholars gathered their personal notes and tucked them away, as if preparing for a journey they had not yet decided to take. The library was still standing. The lamps still burned. The scrolls were still safe. But something essential had shifted. For the first time in its long life, The library was no longer merely a place of learning. It was becoming a question, and questions, I knew, were far more dangerous than answers. The day scholars began to leave. Morning came without relief. The light that slid into the library's courtyards was pale and hesitant, as if the sun itself were unsure how welcome it still was. Shadows stretched long across the stone, clinging to columns and doorways before finally retreating. The city outside woke slowly, its sounds cautious, restrained. I had not slept. Few of us had. The night's unease had settled into something heavier by dawn, like dust after a collapse. Nothing had fallen yet, but everyone could smell it in the air. In the eastern hall, I found Demetrios standing before a rack of scroll cases. He was not reading the labels. He was counting. "Planning a reorganization?" I asked. He did not smile. "I'm trying to decide what can travel," he said. "Travel where?" He glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Anywhere that isn't here." I joined him, running my finger along the wooden edge of a niche. The cases were warm now, touched by the rising day. Each one held months, sometimes years of a life. Not only the life of the author, but of every hand that had copied the text, corrected it, argued with it. "What makes you think they won't let us keep them?" I asked. "They won't stop us from keeping them," Demetrios said. "They'll stop us from using them." That, I realized, was worse. Scholars had always come and gone from Alexandria. Some stayed a season, some stayed a lifetime. The library was a tide that drew minds in and released them again, changed. But this was different. These departures were quiet, deliberate, permanent. Near the colonnade, a pair of mathematicians sat with their belongings gathered neatly at their feet. Wax tablets stacked, a single scroll case each, nothing more. One of them traced a figure on the stone with his finger, out of habit, I knew, not need. "Where will you go?" I asked. "Antioch," he said. "For now? And after that?" He shrugged. "Wherever the questions still outnumber the answers." By midday, the library felt hollow in places that had once hummed. Chairs stood empty, tables lay cleared. The writing rooms echoed faintly, as if surprised by their own silence. This was how the library began to lose itself, not by force, but by attrition. In the afternoon, a group of officials arrived. They did not wear armor. They did not raise their voices. They walked as men who believed the space belonged to them by right, their sandals clean, their expressions carefully neutral. I stood with Helena and several others near the entrance hall as they spoke to the senior custodians. "We are here to ensure order," the lead official said. "Nothing more." "Order has never been lacking here," Helena replied. He inclined his head. "Order changes." They asked for inventories, for categories, for explanations. Why so many copies? Why preserve disagreements? Why keep texts that no longer serve the people? The questions were polite, reasonable even. That was what made them dangerous. One official lifted a scroll case, weighing it in his hands as if testing its worth. "Much of this," he said, "belongs to an earlier world." "All of this belongs to earlier worlds," Helena said. "That is the point." He smiled thinly. "The people need guidance, not confusion." "And you believe confusion comes from choice?" she asked. "From contradiction?" I watched Demetrios's hands tighten at his sides. The officials did not confiscate anything. They did not seal rooms or post guards. They left as they had come, leaving behind only the memory of their questions. But the questions lingered. That evening, I walked through the western storage hall and noticed empty spaces where scroll cases had been. Not taken removed by their guardians, carried away quietly under cloaks, destined for private collections, monasteries, distant cities. Some would survive, many would not. At sunset, I stood again beneath the fig tree. More fruit had fallen, splitting open against the stone. Ants worked tirelessly, carrying pieces away grain by grain. No one commanded them. No one mourned the figs. I thought of Helena's words. They will decide that forgetting is an act of devotion. The library still stood. The shelves were still full enough to impress any visitor. The lamps still burned each night, but its heart was thinning. As darkness returned, I felt the city watching us, not with hatred, but with expectation, as if it were waiting to see whether we would adapt, retreat, or disappear. I stepped back inside, knowing that the night ahead would not be like the ones before. Somewhere beyond the walls, a decision was being made, and soon it would no longer be ours. The what was no longer copied. That night, the writing rooms were full, but not with certainty. Lamps burned as they always had, their flames steady, their light carefully angled. Pens moved, scrolls lay open. At first glance, nothing had changed. A visitor might have believed the library untouched, continuing its quiet labor beyond the reach of the city's worries. But the change was there, threaded through the work like a flaw in the fiber of cloth. It revealed itself in hesitation. I took my place at the table near the window and unrolled the scroll assigned to me. The text was old, copied many times before, its margins filled with notes from hands long gone. It described a device meant to lift water from a river using a system of rotating wheels and angled blades. Practical, ingenious, entirely unconcerned with doctrine. I read the opening lines, then paused. Across the room, another scribe did the same. It was not fear that stopped us. Not yet. It was calculation. Before, the question had always been simple. Is this accurate? Now another had crept in. Is this acceptable? No one had issued a list. No decree had been posted. But everyone understood that some texts drew more attention than others. Works that spoke of gods as metaphors, of the heavens as systems rather than wills, of the body as matter instead of mystery. These scrolls did not shout their defiance. They whispered it. I looked again at the title, On Motion and Force. Nearby, a young apprentice glanced at me, then at the scroll in front of him. His was poetry, harmless, beautiful, safely distant from controversy. He bent over it with visible relief and began to write. I did not blame him. The library had always taught discernment. Which sources to trust, which arguments to test, which conclusions to doubt. But this was a different kind of discernment. This was selection shaped by survival. Demetrios approached quietly and leaned against the edge of my table. He did not look at the scroll. Leave that one, he said softly. And copy what instead? I asked. There's a commentary on rhetoric in the next case. 3 copies already exist. And this one? 1 fewer tomorrow will not be noticed. I studied the ink-stained grain of the table. That isn't how this place works. It may be how it survives. I wanted to argue, to remind him that survival purchased this way was a slow death. But I saw the strain in his face, the careful exhaustion of a man who had been making quiet choices for too long. He moved on without waiting for my answer. Around me, the sound of writing resumed, but it had changed. Where once pens moved with confidence, now they hesitated, lifting more often from the page. The pauses grew longer. The lamps seemed dimmer, though I knew they were not. In one corner of the room, a scholar closed a scroll he had barely begun and returned it to its case. He chose another history, safely framed as past rather than possibility. This was how knowledge began to vanish, not through destruction, but through neglect. A text not copied became fragile. Its papyrus dried, its ink faded. One accident, a spill, a tear, a careless hand could end it forever. The library had always fought this entropy with redundancy. Copies layered upon copies, each one a small act of defiance against time. Now that defense was weakening. I made my choice. Slowly, deliberately, I dipped my pen and began to write. The device described in the scroll unfolded line by line beneath my hand. Wheels, axles, angles measured not by faith, but by observation. The language was precise, the reasoning calm. Whoever had written it believed that the world could be understood if one was patient enough to look. As I worked, the fear receded, not because it was gone, but because purpose had replaced it. If this was to be the last copy, then it would be a good one. Hours passed. At some point, Helena appeared beside me. She watched in silence for a long moment, then placed a small object near my lamp. A second pen, freshly cut. "You'll need it," she said. "Others are stopping," I replied quietly. "Yes," she said, "and some of us are continuing." She moved away before I could respond. When dawn approached, the room thinned. Lamps were extinguished. Scrolls were tied and set aside. I finished the final line just as the sky beyond the window began to pale. My fingers ached. My eyes burned. But the copy was complete. I tied it carefully and added it to the drying shelf, placing it between two safer works, hoping anonymity might protect it. It was a small hope. But small hopes were all the library had ever truly relied on. As I left the writing room, I noticed how many scroll cases remained unopened, how many labels went untouched. Entire categories of mechanics, natural philosophy, astronomy were being approached less often now, like rooms in a house people no longer wished to enter. Outside, the city was waking. Vendors called out. Doors opened. Life resumed its familiar shape. Alexandria looked unchanged to anyone who did not know how to read its silences. But something essential had shifted. The library was still full, yet already it was beginning to forget. And forgetting, I understood then, was not an accident. It was a choice. The order came at dusk. The order did not arrive with raised voices. It came at dusk, carried by men who spoke softly and walked as though they had every right to be there, which, in time, they would. The sun was already lowering itself toward the western sea when they entered the outer courtyard, their shadows stretching long and thin across the stone. I was standing near the fig tree when I saw them. 4 men this time. No armor, no insignia worth noticing. One carried a rolled parchment sealed with wax. Another held a small wooden tablet. its surface scratched with notes. They looked like administrators, the kind that believed history moved because they recorded it. Helena joined me without a word. "So," she said quietly, "they've decided." "They always decide," I replied. "The question is what they call it." The men spoke first with the senior custodians, their voices low enough that I could not hear the words, but clear enough to read the posture. This was not negotiation. This was instruction framed as cooperation. After a few minutes, the custodian nodded once. That single movement carried more weight than any shout. We were gathered in the main hall shortly afterward, not summoned, invited. The difference mattered, or so they believed. Lamps were lit earlier than usual, their light catching on the smooth faces of the statues along the walls. Poets and philosophers watched the living with stone patience. The man with the sealed parchment stepped forward. "For the sake of clarity," he began, "certain materials within this collection will require review." No one interrupted him. "The city is entering a period of consolidation," he continued. "As such, it is important that public knowledge reflects unity rather than division." A murmur passed through the hall, not outrage, but recognition. "Texts that contradict established teachings," he said, "or that promote interpretations no longer aligned with the needs of the people, will be temporarily restricted." "Restricted how?" Demetrios asked. The man met his gaze calmly. "They will be removed from circulation." "And after review?" Helena asked. A pause, barely perceptible, but real. "After review," the man said, "we will decide what remains useful." Useful. The word settled over us like ash. Another official stepped forward, consulting his tablet. "This is not a condemnation of knowledge," he said, as if anticipating our thoughts. "It is a refinement. Excess has accumulated here over centuries. Contradiction breeds confusion. Confusion breeds doubt. And doubt," Helena said, "is how understanding begins." The man smiled politely. "Not anymore." They did not specify which texts would be taken. They did not need to. Everyone in the hall already knew. Astronomy that challenged sacred cosmology. Natural philosophy that explained life without invoking the divine. Mechanisms that implied the world could be mastered by calculation alone. They were not after errors. They were after alternatives. "You may continue your work," the first man said, rolling the parchment back into its seal, "within revised boundaries." "And if we do not?" someone asked from the back. The man did not turn. "Then the work will continue without you." That was all. They left as they had arrived, footsteps measured, expressions unchanged. The lamps flickered slightly in their wake, as if the air itself had been disturbed. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the hall began to empty, not in panic, but in thought. Scholars drifted away in small groups or alone, each carrying the same question. What now does it mean to stay? I walked the corridors as night fully claimed the city. Doors that once stood open were now closed. In several rooms, scroll cases had been stacked near exits, ready to be moved at a moment's notice. In others, lamps burned brighter than usual, pens moving faster, as if speed itself could preserve something. I found Helena in the storage hall, standing before a section labeled simply Natural Philosophy. "They'll come here first," she said. "Tonight?" I asked. "Soon," she replied. "Soon enough that it matters what we do next." I looked at the shelves rows upon rows of thought, experiment, speculation. Centuries of people asking why instead of who says so. "We can't save everything," I said. "No," she agreed, "but we can choose." That night, the library changed its purpose. It was no longer a place that gathered all knowledge. It became a place that hid it. Scrolls were quietly relocated, misfiled on purpose, tucked behind safer works, moved into private hands, carried out beneath cloaks into the city's maze of streets. Codes were invented on the spot, labels altered, catalogues quietly adjusted. It was not rebellion, it was preservation under constraint. Near midnight, I returned to the writing room. Only a handful of lamps remained lit. Demetrios was there, copying with a speed I had never seen from him before. His movements were precise, urgent, stripped of hesitation. "They'll take the originals," he said without looking up. "Copies might slip through. And if they don't, then at least the words were written once more." I took my place beside him and unrolled a scroll I had hidden earlier, one that described the movement of the stars without reference to gods or omens. I began to copy, my hand steady despite the weight of the moment. Outside, the city slept. Inside, the library worked against time itself. The order had come at dusk, and with it, the understanding that this night was no longer just another night. It was the beginning of the end measured, not in flames, but in choices. What was saved by accident? Not all survival is intentional. That was the lesson the library learned next. The first removals happened quietly. At dawn, before the city fully woke, men arrived with lists that were shorter than anyone expected. They walked through the halls accompanied by custodians who no longer argued. Doors were opened. Scroll cases were lifted, inspected, set aside. There was no violence in it, no anger, only efficiency. The officials did not know what they were looking at in detail, and they did not care to learn. Titles were enough, categories sufficient. If a label suggested contradiction, it was marked. If it hinted at unnecessary complexity, it was taken. What they missed was almost everything else. They did not know which texts were originals and which were copies. They did not know which scrolls held the dangerous idea and which merely commented on it. They did not know that the most radical thoughts were often buried inside harmless-looking discussions, hidden behind polite language and cautious phrasing. They assumed knowledge announced itself. It rarely does. In the confusion of reclassification, mistakes were made. Scrolls were placed in the wrong stacks. Cases were returned to shelves they did not belong on. One official, unable to read Greek beyond the simplest headings, waved off a bundle marked "Problems in Geometry," unaware that it contained an argument about infinity that unsettled even the scholars who studied it. Another ignored a set of medical texts because the ink had faded and the script looked old-fashioned, not realizing that age was precisely what made them valuable. Knowledge survived that day, not because it was defended, but because it was overlooked. I watched as a scroll I had copied the night before was passed over, dismissed as redundant. 3 copies already existed, the official said. 1 more made no difference. He was right, and that was why it lived. In the afternoon, a young assistant was tasked with clearing a side room near the western wing. He stacked scroll cases quickly, careless in his haste, and pushed them onto a cart bound for storage outside the main complex. One case cracked as it fell, spilling its contents onto the floor. Annoyed, he scooped the scrolls back inside at random and sealed the case again. Inside that case were fragments, partial texts, unfinished works, marginal notes that scholars had once deemed unimportant. No titles, no names, only thoughts in motion. That case would not be opened again for generations. I did not know this at the time. None of us did. We were too busy choosing what to lose on purpose. Helena passed me in the corridor, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth rather than wood. "These won't survive the shelves," she said quietly. "They need hands." She meant memory. Some texts were read aloud one final time, not to copy them, but to absorb them. Groups gathered in private rooms, doors closed, voices low. Diagrams were traced into dust on tabletops. Arguments were repeated until they could be carried without ink. This too was accidental preservation. What a person remembered, no one could confiscate. Demetrios hid 3 scrolls inside a commentary on rhetoric so dull that no one had touched it in years. The outer text praised order and discipline. Inside, folded carefully, were designs for machines that converted motion in ways the world would not see again for centuries. He did not tell me until afterward. "Why that one?" I asked. "Because no one has ever finished reading it," he said. As night returned, the library grew quieter than it had ever been. Entire halls were closed now, their lamps dark, their air still. The living heart of the place had retreated inward, concentrating itself into fewer rooms, fewer hands. And yet, in that contraction, something unexpected happened. The work became sharper. Every decision mattered. Every choice to copy, to hide, to remember, carried weight. The casual abundance of knowledge, the assumption that everything could be saved, was gone. What remained was intention. In one writing room, I saw an apprentice copying not from a scroll, but from a man's spoken words. He wrote slowly, carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. "What is it?" I asked. "A theory," the man replied. "From memory." "Whose?" The man smiled faintly. "Someone who no longer exists on the shelves." Outside, the city celebrated a minor festival. Music drifted faintly through the walls. Laughter rose and fell. Alexandria, to anyone not looking closely, was thriving. Inside, the library was shrinking, but it was also scattering. Like seeds carried by wind, pieces of it were being lodged in places no one had planned. Private homes, distant cities, careless bundles, fading minds. Some would die there. Some would take root centuries later in soil that did not yet exist. History would later argue about fires, about blame, about dates and perpetrators. It would miss this part entirely, that the greatest survival of knowledge had nothing to do with heroism. It came from accidents, from mistakes, from people doing their work imperfectly under pressure. As I walked past the fig tree that night, I noticed new growth at its base, small shoots pushing through cracks in the stone where fallen fruit had been crushed and forgotten. No one had planted them, and yet they were there. The library was being dismantled, but it was also escaping, and neither the city nor its rulers would ever fully understand how much slipped through their hands simply because they did not know what to look for. The scroll that could not be rewritten. Some losses announced themselves. They arrive loudly, leaving ash and broken stone behind so that no one can pretend they did not happen. Others pass almost unnoticed, their absence discovered only much later, when someone goes searching for what should be there and finds only silence. The scroll I lost belonged to the second kind. I had seen it many times before. It lived in a narrow section of the Eastern Hall, between works on geometry and treatises on natural motion. Its case was unremarkable, its label worn from handling. No one lingered over it, no one argued about it. That should have been a warning. It was not a grand work. It did not claim to explain the universe or challenge the gods. It did not offer sweeping conclusions. Instead, it did something far more dangerous. It described a method, not a finished invention, but a way of thinking, step by step, precise, repeatable. It showed how small adjustments in design produced measurable changes in outcome, how observation could replace assumption, how errors, once measured, could become instruction. The author's name was unfamiliar even to us. Not forgotten exactly, just never famous. A man who had worked patiently, tested his ideas, written them down, and moved on. Those were always the first to vanish. I noticed the empty space where the scroll should have been late in the afternoon. At first, I assumed it had been moved. Shelves were in constant flux now, their order shifting daily. But when I checked the catalogue, the entry was gone, not crossed out, gone. I searched the neighbouring sections, then the storage rooms, then the writing tables where scrolls waited to be copied. I asked Demetrios. I asked Helena. No one had seen it taken. No one had hidden it. It had not been deemed dangerous. It had simply failed to be noticed. By the time I understood what that meant, it was already too late. That evening, as the sun lowered and the shadows lengthened, the officials returned, not to remove more texts, but to collect those already marked. Crates were brought in. Scroll cases were stacked without ceremony, their contents invisible once sealed. I watched as one crate was carried past me, its lid slightly loose. Inside, I caught a glimpse of papyrus rolled, unmarked, indistinguishable from any other. It might have been there, or it might not. There was no way to know. I followed the crate as far as I could, to the edge of the courtyard where carts waited. Beyond that point, access was restricted. The crate was loaded, tied down, and covered with cloth. It would be stored, I was told. Reviewed later. I had heard those words before. In the writing room that night, I sat before a blank sheet of papyrus and tried to reconstruct the scroll from memory. I remembered fragments, the structure of the argument, the care with which each step followed the last. But memory is not method. I could not recall the exact proportions, the measurements that gave the ideas their strength. Without them, the work became philosophy. It lost what made it dangerous. I wrote what I could, knowing even as I did that it was not enough. The spaces between the ideas, the precise places where the author had tested and corrected himself, were gone. When I finished, the copy felt hollow in my hands. Around me, others worked in the same uneasy silence. Some copied with urgency. Others stared at their texts, unmoving, as if afraid that writing might make loss real. Near midnight, Helena sat beside me. "You can't save everything," she said gently. "I know, but you're still trying to save this one?" "I don't know why," I admitted. She considered that. because it teaches how to think, not what to think. I closed my eyes. The crate was already gone, the cart already moving. Somewhere beyond the walls of Alexandria, the scroll would sit unread, its papyrus drying, its ink fading. Or it would be unrolled carelessly and discarded. Or it would be lost entirely, mistaken for something replaceable. No one would burn it. No one needed to. That night, I learned the most painful lesson the library had to offer. Knowledge does not disappear when it is attacked. It disappears when no one notices that it is gone. As I left the writing room, the lamps were dimmed lower than usual. The corridors felt longer. The shelves, once so reassuring in their abundance, now seemed fragile, provisional. I passed the place where the scroll had been and touched the wood lightly, as if it might remember what I could not. Outside, the city slept, and somewhere, a method quiet, precise, and endlessly useful slipped out of the world, without a sound. A world that became smaller. But the change did not announce itself with absence. No one woke one morning to find the world suddenly emptier, its borders pulled inward, its horizons collapsed. The city continued. Trade resumed. Ships came and went. Children learned their letters. Prayers were spoken with confidence. And yet, something had begun to contract. I noticed it first in the questions. A young student approached me in the courtyard one afternoon, his expression earnest, his hands empty of scrolls. "Is it true," he asked, "that there are machines that can lift water without animals?" "Yes," I said, "there were. Where can I read about them?" I hesitated. The answer used to be simple. A shelf, a case, a text. Now it was a memory, incomplete and unreliable. "There are descriptions," I said carefully. "Scattered ones." His brow furrowed. "But where do they begin?" I had no reply that satisfied either of us. That was how the world grew smaller, not through ignorance, but through broken paths. Knowledge still existed in fragments, but the maps that connected those fragments were gone. Without the library's structure, ideas drifted, isolated from one another, unable to combine. I saw it in the workshops near the harbour. Craftsmen still built cranes and presses, still solved practical problems with clever hands. But when a design failed, it was abandoned rather than refined. No one went searching for older attempts. No one compared methods across generations. Trial replaced memory. In the market, a physician argued with a merchant over the cause of an illness. "It is imbalance," the physician insisted. "The humours." "But my neighbour recovered after a different treatment," the merchant replied. "Coincidence," the physician said, already turning away. Once, such a disagreement would have ended in the library, with texts spread across a table, arguments sharpened by evidence. Now it ended in certainty. The city's confidence grew. Its curiosity did not. I walked the streets and listened. Stories that had once been told as possibilities hardened into rules. The sky was no longer something to be measured, but something to be interpreted. The body was no longer a system to be studied, but a vessel to be judged. Nature was no longer a set of patterns, but a sequence of signs. This made life simpler. It also made it smaller. One evening, I stood near the harbour and watched the ships arrive. A sailor leaned against the railing, gazing at the lighthouse with a look of relief. "How far is the world?" he asked, no one in particular. "Farther than you think," an old dock worker replied. The sailor laughed. Not anymore. He was wrong, of course. The world had not shrunk, but the part of it people were willing to imagine had. Without the accumulated memory of the library, each generation began again closer to the ground. They learned what worked immediately, what could be proven in a lifetime. Long arcs of thought ideas that required patience across centuries were abandoned. Why map the stars when the seasons still came? Why measure the earth when roads could be counted by days of travel? Why question when answers already existed? I returned to the library's halls, now quieter than ever. Entire sections were sealed, their lamps dark. The fig tree in the courtyard had grown new leaves, unaware that its roots now spread beneath emptier rooms. Helena joined me as I stood before a closed door. They say the world will be clearer now, she said. For whom? I asked. For those who speak, she replied. Not for those who ask. We walked together through the corridors one last time. I traced the stone walls, feeling their cool solidity. These walls had once contained the widest vision the world had ever attempted. Now they held something narrower order, certainty, purpose. The shelves that remained were tidy, the catalogue precise, the contradictions fewer. The library in its new form was efficient, but efficiency had come at a cost. Outside, the city felt confident, even triumphant. Inside, the silence was no longer peaceful. It was complete. I thought of the scroll that had vanished without notice, of the methods that could no longer be taught because their steps had been lost, of the questions that would never be asked because no one remembered that answers had once been provisional. This was not a catastrophe. It was an adjustment. And adjustments, I realized, are far more dangerous. They do not look like loss. They look like progress. Why the library had to disappear. For a long time, I believed the library was destroyed by ignorance. It was an easy belief, comfortable. Ignorance was something to oppose, something external and clumsy. It arrived without subtlety and left ruin behind. That kind of enemy made sense. But as the days passed and the halls grew quieter, another truth became harder to ignore. The library did not fall because people were ignorant. It fell because they were afraid. Not afraid of knowledge itself, but of what knowledge demanded in return. Inside these walls, nothing was ever final. Every claim waited to be challenged. Every authority expected to be questioned. Even the most respected names, Aristotle, Euclid, Hipparchus, were treated not as voices to obey, but as starting points. That way of thinking is exhausting. It requires patience, humility, and the willingness to live without certainty. For a time, Alexandria could afford that luxury. It was wealthy, secure, confident in its place in the world. Now it was none of those things. Empires were tightening their grip. Faiths were organizing themselves into structures that could survive chaos. People wanted answers that did not shift beneath their feet. The library offered no such comfort. It offered only better questions. I saw this clearly during a conversation I overheard in the city, days after the removals had begun. Two men stood outside a bathhouse, steam curling into the air between them. The old ways confused people, one said. Too many voices. That's called thinking, the other replied. The first shook his head. Thinking is a privilege. Most people need guidance. Guidance. The word had become a shield. In the library, Disagreement was a sign of life. Outside it, disagreement was becoming a threat. Order depended on shared belief, not shared inquiry. And inquiry, by its nature, disrupted order. The library asked people to accept uncertainty as a permanent condition, to admit that the world was larger than any single explanation. But a society under pressure does not want largeness. It wants walls. I thought of the scrolls that described the earth as a sphere. Not because it offended faith, many beliefs could absorb that, but because it implied something unsettling, that no single place was the center. That perspective mattered. That truth changed depending on where you stood. Those ideas did not help rulers rule. They did not help priests preach. They did not help people sleep. The library was dangerous, not because it contradicted doctrine, but because it trained minds to expect contradiction. It made certainty feel temporary. It weakened the authority of anyone who claimed to possess final answers. In a fragile world, that was intolerable. Helena said it best one evening as we watched the lamps being extinguished for the night. The library asks too much of people, she said. It assumes they want to understand. And they don't, I asked. They want to belong. I could not argue with that. Belonging offers warmth. Understanding offers distance. When the two conflict, most choose warmth. The disappearance of the library was not an act of malice. It was a decision made collectively, though no one would ever admit responsibility. Each person gave up a small part of it in exchange for something else: stability, certainty, peace. No one felt the loss immediately. That was the brilliance of it. The library did not collapse under attack. It was dismantled because it no longer fit the shape of the world. Its open-ended thinking belonged to an era that could tolerate ambiguity. This era could not. As night settled again over Alexandria, I walked through the nearly empty halls and understood something that had eluded me before. The library did not disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it succeeded. It had shown what the human mind could become. And the world, unready for that responsibility, chose to look away. The keeper walks away. I did not decide to leave all at once. Leaving, I learned, is rarely a single moment. It is a sequence of realizations that eventually align. A door closed here, a lamp extinguished there. A question left unanswered because no one remained to ask it. By the time I understood my decision, it had already been made. The library was quiet in a way it had never been before. Not the working silence of concentration, but the settled silence of completion, as if the building itself believed its task was finished. I walked its corridors one final time. The writing rooms stood orderly, their tables clean, their lamps cold. A few pens lay where they had been set down and never picked up again. In the storage halls, the shelves looked intact to an untrained eye, still full enough, still impressive. But I knew where the gaps were. I felt them as absences rather than spaces. In the courtyard, the fig tree cast a familiar shadow. Its leaves whispered faintly in the morning air. Life had adapted easily to the change. Plants always do. I paused before the niche where I had often stood to let my eyes adjust before entering the inner halls. The lamp there was unlit now. No one had said it should be. No one needed to. Some endings require no instruction. Helena met me near the eastern wing. She carried nothing with her, not a scroll, not a bundle, not even a tablet. Her hands were empty, and she looked lighter for it. "So," she said. "So," I agreed. "You won't stay," she said, not accusing, not asking. "No." She nodded once. "Neither will I." We did not speak of destinations. Those details felt unimportant. The world beyond Alexandria was large, even if people were pretending otherwise. Somewhere, there would still be room for questions. Somewhere, fragments of what we had guarded would resurface, strange and unfinished, waiting to be recognized. At the entrance, I turned back. For years, I had believed that the library needed keepers, that without us, it would vanish entirely. Now I understood the arrogance of that thought. The library had never belonged to us. We had belonged to it, briefly, like any other generation that passed through its care. What mattered was not the building. It was the habit of mind it had cultivated. I stepped outside into the city. Alexandria was awake, bright with morning. Merchants called out their wares. Children ran along the streets. Ships waited in the harbor, sails slack, patient. To anyone watching, nothing had ended. That was the strangest part. The world does not pause for the loss of its memory. I walked away without ceremony, without farewell. No one stopped me. No one asked what I carried with me. I carried nothing. And yet, with each step, I felt the weight of what could not be taken. Methods learned, questions sharpened, the quiet discipline of doubt. These were not objects. They could not be catalogued or restricted. They walked with me. As the library receded behind the buildings and the streets narrowed, I realized something else. The library was not gone. It had simply stopped living in one place. What remains while you sleep? Long after I left Alexandria, I learned to recognize the library in unexpected places. I saw it in a quiet room where someone paused before accepting an easy answer. I heard it in a conversation that allowed silence rather than rushing to agreement. I felt it in the patience of a person who measured twice before acting once. The library no longer had walls. That, in the end, was its final transformation. People like to imagine that knowledge is always awake alert, active, demanding to be used. But knowledge, I discovered, has another state. It rests, it waits. It sleeps when the world grows too loud to hear it. The loss of the library was not the end of understanding. It was the beginning of a long pause. For centuries, the questions it had gathered would drift beneath the surface of thought, unspoken but not erased. Ideas would reappear without knowing their ancestors. Methods would be rediscovered, not as memories, but as revelations. People would believe they were seeing something new, unaware that they were waking something very old. This, too, is how knowledge survives. Not in uninterrupted lines, but in returns. As night settles and the mind loosens its grip on the day, something quiet happens. Certainty softens. Curiosity stirs. The need to be right gives way to the desire to understand. In those moments, fleeting and fragile, the library breathes again. It does not demand attention. It waits for it. Perhaps that is why it had to disappear. Perhaps a place that held everything could only endure by becoming nowhere in particular, by dissolving into habits rather than halls, by living in the spaces between thoughts, where questions are allowed to exist without pressure to resolve. Tonight, as you rest, you are closer to it than you might think. Each slow breath clears room for doubt. Each drifting thought loosens the grip of certainty. Each unanswered question becomes an open door. The library is not burning. It is sleeping. And like all things that sleep, it carries the promise of waking when the world is ready to listen again. For now, let the questions rest. Let the answers wait. The night is gentle, and the library remains.